Jeff Sessions signed a last-minute order limiting the use of consent decrees Wednesday, hours before he was fired by President Trump. The order will restrict the ability of law enforcement officials to use court-enforced agreements between the Justice Department and local police departments to enact changes when the police departments have been accused of abuses and civil rights violations. In Paris, President Trump joined leaders Sunday as they gathered to pay tribute to the millions who died in World War I on the 100th anniversary of the armistice that ended the war. At a formal ceremony at the French President warned growing nationalism in countries, including the United States, threatens the world again. After the ceremony, over 70 heads of state attended the Paris Peace Forum, heading to the U.S. shortly after it began. Trump also faced widespread criticism for his decision to cancel his visit to a U.S. military cemetery on Saturday because it was raining. After headlines will speak to historian Adam Hochschild, whose article for The New Yorker earlier this month was headlined 100 years after the armistice. In Yemen, aid workers are warning that a U.S.-backed Saudi-led assault on the port city of Hodeidah threatens to cut off supply lines of food and medicine that are desperately needed by millions. The UN has called Yemen the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe, with some 14 million people on the brink of famine. Over the weekend, the Saudi coalition intensified its assault on Hodeidah, with reports of at least 149 deaths, including civilians, just in the past 24 hours. This is Dr. Mariam Al-Darani of the group Save the Children, speaking from Hodeidah on Friday.
In the last 30 minutes, there were more than 15 airstrikes. 15. I visited today Al-Amal Hospital. I saw one child, he's a teenager, he's 15 years old. He's totally paralyzed because for 3 days he was walking in the street and there is a stray bullet penetrating his neck and cut the spinal cord. He's totally paralyzed.
The New York Times reports top Saudi intelligence officials close to Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman considered a $2 billion plan to hire private intelligence operatives to assassinate prominent Iranians. The Times cited 3 people familiar with discussions about plans to kill Qasem Soleimani, the leader of the Quds Force of Iran's Revolutionary Guards Corps. The plan was reportedly discussed at a meeting arranged by George Nader, a Lebanese American who reportedly pitched the assassination plan to Trump White House officials. In Somalia's capital, Mogadishu, suicide bombers and gunmen attacked a popular hotel Saturday, killing 39 people and wounding 40 others. The militant group Al-Shabaab claimed responsibility. The attack came as the Trump administration has stepped up attacks on Al-Shabaab, with at least 29 airstrikes in Somalia so far this year. In the Gaza Strip, Palestinians say Israeli commandos in a civilian vehicle drove into the southern city of Khan Yunis Sunday in a clandestine raid that killed 7 Hamas members, including a commander. Israel said one of its soldiers had been killed in an exchange of fire before Israel Israel called in tank fire and airstrikes while the commandos escaped back to Israel. After the fighting, Palestinians fired 17 rockets into southern Israel, none of which appear to have caused deaths or injuries. Meanwhile, Israel allowed the government of Qatar to provide millions of dollars in aid to pay the salaries of thousands of Palestinian civil servants who've worked for months without a full paycheck. Israel also allowed a shipment of diesel fuel, also paid for by Qatar, which has reduced the number of hours Gaza residents have spent without electricity. Even with the increased power supply, Gazans have only about 8 hours of electricity per day. And in Oklahoma City, a jury has ordered the insurance giant Aetna to pay over $25 million to the family of a cancer patient who died after she was denied cancer treatment. The jury ruled Aetna acted recklessly in 2014 when 3 of the company's medical directors decided to deny radiation therapy to Arana Cunningham, who had stage 4 cancer near her brainstem. The directors called the treatment experimental, even though the treatment is covered under Medicare. Arana died in 2015 at the age of 54. Doctors think the treatment denied by Aetna might have dramatically extended her life. And there you go this weekend. On Sunday, world leaders gathered in Paris to pay tribute to the dead, marking the anniversary of the armistice of what in 18, about 10 million civilians perished. Almost 10 million soldiers were killed. Another 21 million wounded. On Sunday, French President Emmanuel Macron used his address at the ceremony to caution against the dangers of nationalism.
This vision of France as a generous nation with a vision which carries universal values has been, in those dark times, exactly the opposite of the selfishness of a people which only looks at its own interests.
Car le patriotisme est l'exact contraire.
Because patriotism is the exact opposite of nationalism. Nationalism is its betrayal. By pursuing our own interests first, with no regard to others, we erase the very thing that a nation holds most precious, that which gives it life and makes it great,
Ses valeurs morales.
its moral values.
Macron's comments were widely viewed as a rebuke of President Trump, who's openly described himself as a nationalist. Just before the summit, President Macron also called for formation of a European army. He said, quote, "We have to protect ourselves with respect to China, Russia, and even the United States of America. We need a Europe which defends itself better alone without just depending on the United States in a more sovereign manner." Following the formal ceremony at the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, Macron and German Chancellor Angela Merkel attended a peace conference with nearly 80 heads of state, including Russian President Vladimir Putin and Turkey's Recep Tayyip Erdogan. President Trump did not attend the Paris Peace Forum shortly after it began. Yes, Trump reportedly the only one among 72 leaders to skip the meeting. Trump walked to a U.S. military cemetery in France on Saturday because it was raining. His article for the New Yorker earlier this headlined 100 years after armistice. His other books, To End All Wars, 1914 to 1918, King Leopold's Ghost as well. Adam Hochschild was a co-founder of Mother Jones Magazine. Adam, welcome back to Democracy Now! First, share your response to what took place this weekend on the centennial of World War I.
Hi, Amy. It's always good to be with you. I think my main feeling was for anniversary to bring together world leaders to talk about peace and to talk about how wars like this could be averted in the future. And instead, Trump ignored that, just went through a very perfunctory paying respects to the American dead, not the ones that he would have had to visit in the rain, but others, and then turned around and went home. I think the lesson that we ought to take from looking back at the First World War is that wars break out very easily. People always think, oh, starting a war is going to solve a problem. It usually creates all sorts of other problems instead. Look at what's happened with the United States ventures in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And an anniversary like this is a time for sitting down, thinking about that, talking about that. not turning their back on other world leaders and rushing home.
Quite something. President Trump, on Saturday, while other world leaders visited the cemeteries of their war dead, President Trump, though it was completely planned, he said because of the rain, he wasn't going to the cemetery where how many soldiers, I think over 1,000, perhaps 2,000 American soldiers were buried. If you can talk about who these soldiers are who died in World War I.
Well, these were men who volunteered and men who were drafted and who went to Europe in the last months of the war. The United States, World War I lasted for 4.5 years, from the summer of 1914 until November 11th, 1918. For the first 2.5 of those years, the United States was officially neutral, even though it was selling huge amounts of arms and armaments and ammunition and so forth to the Allied countries, Britain and France above all. But the U.S. was not involved in the fighting. Then the United States joined in the spring of 1917. It took really a little more than a year to get large numbers of American troops sufficiently trained, but starting in the summer of 1918, huge numbers of Americans, young Americans, went to France, very eager to fight, as young men so often and so tragically are all over the world. In fact, when those U.S. troops got to France, many of the men assigned to rear areas began to do what the military called deserting to the front. They had come to Europe to fight and to see glory in battle and not to be loaded supplies in the rear somewhere. So by the end of the war, there were some 2 million American troops in France, and they certainly supplied an important ingredient in the forces that brought the Allied armies to victory. They were fresh and raring to go, unlike the soldiers of the countries that had already been fighting in Europe for more than 4 years. Roughly a little over 100,000 Americans perished in that war, about half of them in combat, and the other half from the great influenza epidemic that swept through the world at that time, killing a huge number of people. But that flu epidemic was closely related to the war because it was first medically noticed on a U.S. Army base in Kansas. And as American troops went to Europe, they carried the flu with them, and then it spread very rapidly through European countries as well. And of course, any kind of disease like that spreads even faster when people who are suffering from it are in close confinement with lots of others in places like troop ships, army barracks, trenches, and so forth.
I wanted to ask you about both French President Macron's comments, clearly alluding to President Trump calling himself a nationalist and saying nationalism is the opposite of patriotism, Macron said. In another apparent rebuke to Trump's policies, German Chancellor Angela Merkel warned of the dangers of isolationism.
Der Erste Weltkrieg hat uns gezeigt.
The First World War shows how isolationism leads to many destructions. And if isolationism wasn't the right solution more than 100 years ago, how could it simply be the right choice today? In an interconnected world that has 5 times more people as today, shaping an interconnected world, this was the motto of our German G20 presidency last year for this very reason.
Adam Pochschild, your response.
Well, I liked President Macron's remarks about the difference between patriotism and nationalism. I think it's an important distinction. The nationalist always thinks, my country first, my country above all. Patriotism, by his definition, I think means something subtle and more and different. It actually reminded me of something which 100 years ago someone quite different said about patriotism. I'm thinking about Emma Goldman, the great anarchist leader, who was one of many Americans who resisted the war and was punished for it. Goldman was sentenced to 2 years in prison for organizing against the draft. And at her trial, she was accused by the prosecution of being unpatriotic. And she replied this way. I'll just read you what she wrote. Gentlemen of the jury, she asked, and of course in those days, juries were all gentlemen, no ladies. May there not be different kinds of patriotism, as there are different kinds of liberty? And her patriotism, she explained, was like that, and these are her words, of the man who loves a woman with open eyes. He is enchanted by her beauty, yet he sees her faults. I think that's a pretty good definition of patriotism, where you can love your country, but you are not blind to its faults. And when you see your country doing something that you think is wrong, such as joining a war that it has no business being in, you have every right to speak out. So my main feeling about the 100th anniversary of this terrible war is that we should be honoring people like Emma Goldman, like Eugene Debs, like social worker Jane Addams, just to speak about Americans, who saw the war as madness when it was going on, did everything they could to bring it to a stop. They were patriots also.
Talk about Jane Addams, Eugene Debs, and others, the heart of your book, To End All
Right.
Wars.
Well, one of the things, when we look back at the First World War, I think at this point, most of us would agree that if there was any one single event in the 20th century that we could reach back and magically undo, wouldn't it be the war of 1914 to 1918? Not only did it produce a colossal death toll, but it left behind a legacy of bitterness and resentment in Germany that Hitler was able to manipulate so cleverly to gain power and start an even more destructive war in the Holocaust as well. I think it's impossible to imagine the Second World War happening without the First. Well, at the time of 1914 to 1918, there were in all of the warring countries extraordinary people who saw what was happening as madness and who